Thanks for joining us, Levi.
Thanks for having me back. Yeah, it's good to see you guys.
Yeah, I think
Good to see you too.
I think you might be our first in-studio guest
in the new studio. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, anyway, yeah, it's great to have you. It's been about a year.
Yeah, that's right. I think
And it's been a good year for persecution, hasn't it?
Oh dear.
You already know the direction this is going.
That is always the
There's always a
tension,
lot to
right?
talk about.
Yeah.
There's for sure.
I mean, look, if you can't make jokes about genocide, what can you make jokes about?
Many, many other things.
Well, so you guys just published at the Falun Dafa Information Center. You published a report called "Pandemic Persecution and Pushback."
That's right.
And one of the things you talk about is transnational repression.
Mm-hmm.
So tell us a bit about what that is.
So that term is really just about tyrannical regimes going after people outside of their country. You tend to think of China and these other regimes as persecuting the people inside the country, but actually they're quite active internationally on the world stage. Freedom House actually published what I'd call a fairly groundbreaking report on this topic worldwide. And no shock, they found that China is the largest aggressor of all the countries in the world.
Wow, congratulations.
Yeah,
Did they get like a Guinness World Records plaque?
I'm not sure if Freedom House sent them anything, maybe a mug, but they were definitely at the top slot, to no one's surprise. And we found that report very interesting, and so we one of the things we did in this report, and we cover several things, but when we looked at transnational repression, we really broke that down in terms of why they're going after Falun Gong, what's the scale of what they're doing to Falun Gong, and kind of the different tactics they use in different countries. So we sort of really bring that out in the report.
That's interesting because you don't hear much about the China going after Falun Gong overseas. Like you hear about Russia poisoning people, obviously, because it's Russia.
Remember Iran?
Iran. I was going to say they tried to assassinate that dissident who lived in New York.
Well, they tried to kidnap her and bring her back to Iran.
Oh, is that what they were doing?
Yeah,
Okay.
but then after Salman Rushdie was attacked and stabbed, the FBI basically moved her to a safe house because they said that Iran was trying to assassinate her too.
Right. And so it doesn't come as a surprise that Iran is doing that and that Russia is.
That was pretty well publicized.
Yeah.
But
I haven't heard anything really in the media, in the mainstream media about the Chinese Communist Party going after, whether going after just Falun Gong overseas or all sorts of groups.
Well, they're fairly prolific at going after anybody that they don't agree with. I mean, the Tibetans, the Taiwanese, this has been happening to them for decades. They go after the Uyghurs to some extent. I mean, Falun Gong, they've been doing this actually since day one. I mean, literally days after the persecution was announced in China, we had people in New York whose apartments were ransacked, and pretty soon after that, some pretty creepy things. We had people who they would be having private conversations in their living room or off in the middle of a public park somewhere with no one else around, planning some sort of activity to expose the human rights abuses in China. And at 3 a.m. that night, they'd get a recording of that private conversation on their phone.
Oh,
Death
geez.
threats would come in, things like that. So
this was like late 90s.
this was at the fall of 1999. So the persecution started in July, and actually not even the fall. I mean, right then. I mean, at the end of July into August, we had people in New York who were we had one person who had to flee New York, who was a sort of a very public kind of volunteer Falun Gong in the city. Because of her apartment being broken into and the death threats and stuff like that, she had to leave for a few months just to stay safe. So it started out kind of like that. It was a very sort of thug kind of behavior. Yeah.
I actually had no idea. I mean, we're talking then about over 20 years of this going on.
Yeah.
Interesting that, I feel like...
I'd never heard about that. I mean, you'd think, but I mean, it's a long time ago, but also if it's still happening and you still don't hear about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's evolved a lot. I mean, a few years after the what I just talked about in New York, you still had stuff like that. We had a guy who was in his house in Atlanta, and he happens to be one of the chief engineers at that time, was just building the software that helps people in China break out of the firewall and actually reach the free internet. So he was helping do that kind of stuff, other human rights work. Some two Asian guys knock at his door one day in Atlanta, posing as water delivery people. They break into, the minute he opens his door, they break into his house, they beat him up, they wrap him in a carpet. Fairly nice house. They steal nothing but his computers and hard drive, and he's left unconscious and bleeding. And so those incidents have happened. We've had people beaten up in front of the consulate in Chicago and San Francisco and New York. And so that stuff has been happening for quite a number of years. what has evolved is it's gotten a lot more sophisticated, using their diplomatic missions, economic coercion, things like that. And since that time, we've had internal CCP documents coming out that very explicitly call for this. We have to take the fight to Falun Gong, divide them and conquer them in the United States and other places. So it is at this point, a very sophisticated mechanism that the CCP uses to silence Falun Gong.
I remember about 4 years ago, we were in Australia with Chris, and we interviewed Chen Ling, who was like a defector from the Chinese consulate in Australia. And he said that every Chinese consulate had someone in charge of like just going after Falun Gong specifically.
Mm-hmm. And in many cases, teams, like a unit in each embassy. And that was sort of the shocker, because he came and testified before Congress here, a year or two after he had defected in Australia. And he kind of laid that out in front of Congress, and people were sort of like shocked. Like, wait a minute, every single diplomatic mission has a team that goes after Falun Gong. That's all they do. And he tried to sort of get them across, because that was kind of his I think it was his primary and perhaps his only function in the embassy or the consulate where he was stationed in Australia. So yeah, I mean, and it made sense to a lot of us who, for at that time, for several years, we've been facing, weird stuff. I mean, pro-Beijing community groups in the local Chinatowns, or even the student groups on Columbia campus, Columbia University or other universities around, just violently, sort of viscerally organized against Falun Gong, and very much organized. It was clear these weren't just a couple people that were, had a little too much propaganda in the head. This was clearly, groups that were coming and attacking us. So when we heard Chen's testimony, we were like, yeah, this makes sense. Clearly, this is being pushed by the embassy.
So this is all done, like, this isn't just the embassies or consulates deciding, like, let's go after Falun Gong. Like, that sounds fun. Like, it's a centrally directed thing.
What do you guys want to do today? Yeah. It's one of the most there's a lot of convincing evidence of that. There are other defectors that have come out that have said, yeah, they're doing this kind of thing. But one of the things we got a hold of many years ago was an internal CCP document that's very explicit. I mean, it's very clear about, you guys have heard of the 610 office, right? This sort of Gestapo for Falun Gong. It's the extra legal agency, for your viewers in China, that's responsible for persecuting Falun Gong. Well, it's not just in China. They're actually responsible for persecuting Falun Gong around the world. And their main hub in China to coordinate the worldwide activities is in Tianjin. And so these internal CCP documents coming out of there that call for, I was surprised. I read a lot of CCP propaganda and sort of visceral, vile kind of things against Falun Gong, but how explicit they were in the language about going after Falun Gong, using economic means, using diplomatic means, divide friends, use cultural institutions. And I mean, it was very explicit and very sort of long about how you attack Falun Gong overseas. And it was this sort of CCP mandate. And that's sort of the guiding document for what can you tell.
So it's like an instruction manual.
It's an instruction manual. Yeah.
How old was this document? Like, is it from the beginning of the Falun Gong persecution?
Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, there's been a few of these documents, and the one specifically I'm referencing is relatively new. The document is new; it's relatively new, coming into our hands. We got it about 3 years ago.
Okay.
But there had been other documents before that, and there was a CCP official that defected and sort of brought the same message. It's like, yeah, guys, we're not just doing this in China. You know that, right? This is a global campaign. And it makes sense, because at this point, Falun Gong is that community, or out of that community, has been some of the strongest and most potent sort of whistleblowing of what the CCP is doing and what they're really up to. And so, yeah.
Yeah, that is actually one of the reasons I was asking about how recent that document is, because I think like the Communist Party started going after Falun Gong in the late 90s, it feels like a long time ago. It feels like, kind of how free Tibet is not exactly top of mind anymore,
priority, yeah,
for people. And so it's interesting to hear that even 3 years ago, they're still like, we have to go after them.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think what's interesting is, at least from what we can tell, there's different reasons over time. It's kind of had a three-phase approach. Like in the very first few years, this persecution was mandated from the top. The top guy in the CCP said, go after Falun Gong, predominantly for his own political power purposes. And so that's why it was number one. And that's why, he's going to the APEC meeting in 1999 and saying, hey, Bill Clinton, first thing I want to talk to you about, Falun Gong. And this was happening in the first few years.
Wait, before let us join the World Trade Organization?
Sort of like in parallel.
Yeah.
In parallel.
I mean, they needed the money from the WTO trade to then go after Falun Gong. Obviously, it's expensive to persecute people.
And I think it's a good point. It's like the mentality, right? If something that is so important to trade is on the table, and yet the first time you see Bill Clinton in APEC, you say, you know what, let me hand you this big book on Falun Gong and why it's so evil and why we're going after him.
Jiang Zemin actually handed Bill Clinton.
Yeah, there's actually footage of this. You can see it. I think AP or CNN captured it, where he walks up and it's this big, stack of like books and magazines, and he hands it to him, and that's their first interaction.
Like, okay, firstly, that's super weird because like heads of state don't like give each other a document at like a meet. Like that's like.
And then he pulled out a comb and started combing his hair. I think I don't know. I'm not sure.
That was another time.
That was Jiang Zemin combing his hair in front of the King of Spain.
Yeah,
I think you're referencing.
Yeah.
He was kind of a weird guy.
He was
a weird guy, but
an
like
understatement.
Yeah.
So back to your question is like, why over so many years, why it's the top issue. It's changed. The first few years, it was because of that. Then it became, look, what was happening to Falun Gong as early as 2002, 2003, horrific. There's rampant torture, rampant gang rape being used and you guys have covered this on your show, being actually used as a tool of suppression, or forced organ harvesting has come out. So this is the time period where people are starting to use the word genocide, right? So after Jiang Zemin stepped down, what I believe became the impetus for it to still be the number one issue is cover-up. We've got to put a lid on this because now people are starting to accuse of genocide. And so you have that. But then in the last 10 years, out of the Falun Gong community has come media companies and human rights organizations and cultural institutions that really, combined, if you look at them, have really led the way in terms of pointing out the danger of the CCP to the world. And I think that is now the driver. Yes, it's still Jiang Zemin's campaign and he has some power in China. Yes, it's still a cover-up. But now it's about, we've got a whistleblower on the stage that knows us inside and out. We've got to silence him. And I think that's what keeps it kind of at the top priority after more than 20 years.
So you're saying that Falun Gong is now like the main whistleblower?
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's kind of an interesting, the persecution of Falun Gong this is what you talked about last time on the podcast, how like this repression then led Falun Gong, which was basically just doing like meditation or Qigong in the park, right? Like led them to become what they were not before, which is a political organization. Ironically, they were accused of being political before they were, and then they were persecuted. And they became political in the sense of basically raising awareness about the persecution and have increasingly become, now you say, the key voice in exposing the crimes of the Chinese Communist Party. So they've created their own nemesis.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's also
a good movie.
It's also interesting because, like, when we hear like, oh, you're getting like they were accused of being political, that doesn't seem like a really bad thing in the U.S. So like all of our social issues that people talk about end up being political. Like it's not. But in China at the time, being accused of being political was one of the worst things you could accuse somebody of, because that is. You are the only thing that is allowed to be political is the Chinese Communist Party.
Right.
Well, they're political and they're backed by the CIA, right? Those two things go together, right?
Yeah. Well, we've been accused of being backed by the CIA more than once.
Yeah, which is like unfortunate because like we're in the worst case because we're accused of it, but we don't actually get any of that CIA money. Whereas like at least we'd want to get some of that money.